Okay, week one, we are going to get started by talking about who the students are that we teach. Now, I want to throw this caveat out there that you're going to hear information that you already heard in your Foundations of Special Education course. I will say two things about that. One is this course is all about how to differentiate your instruction, and you do that with students with disabilities. So you're going to be hearing things you've already heard before, but we're digging a little bit further into it in terms of instruction. So that's one. But two, it's important to hear things more than one time to really learn it. So it's not a bad thing to hear things again. So I would say if you're hearing something for the second time, don't dismiss it, kind of dig into it because it's just going to help you better internalize it. But I digress. So this week we're talking about who we teach because actually who we teach is more important than what we teach. If we're not catering our instruction to the students in front of us, there's a good chance most of them are not learning. So it's important to pay attention to who it is that we teach. So we're talking about students with disabilities, English language learners, and then gifted and talented learners. And then we'll do a quick review of IEPs and 504s. So our learning target is I can compare the purposes and elements of a 504 plan and an IEP. So let's think about who it is that we have in our classrooms, because again, we will have all different kinds of learners in any kind of classroom that we're teaching. So the three different kinds of students we might have, or when we're talking about who we might need to differentiate for, three of the types would be English language learners, students with disabilities, and then gifted and talented. Of course, there are other students in your classroom. That doesn't mean that they are in the middle or average. They're actually, I included a link here to the flaw of averages. It's a quick read, but about how an average actually doesn't really exist. I really strongly encourage you to take a look at it. It's like I said, a quick read, but it really goes to show there actually is no average. So it's so important to think about, yes, these three groups of students here, we do have to differentiate for, but that doesn't mean we're not going to differentiate for the rest of the students in our class. So I do recommend that you take a look at that. It's very interesting. But so let's start with students with disabilities. You heard in your, I assume in your Foundations of Special Education course, you learned all about the 13 classifications. I just have a resource linked here in case you want to refresh your memory. But when we think about students with disabilities, what are the kinds of things that we have to do for them? Well, first is we have to accommodate them, right? Like we need to give them access points to the general education curriculum so that they can enter at a point that makes the best sense to them. We also have to make modifications. Sometimes we do have to change the things that we do with students with disabilities to factor in what their struggles may be. And then ultimately, what we're doing is whatever it is that we need to do that to help them meet their goals, the goals on their IEP or things noted on a 504, or we're even talking about the general education curriculum. So I included a sample 504 and IEP, again, just as a refresher, but it's important to know where to find this information in those two documents, where to find specific accommodations and modifications that will help you differentiate your instruction for these students. So I suggest you take a look at those to kind of refresh your memory. And if you have questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask. Then we have our English language learners. So these are students who there's a wide range of their needs even within this group, because there are students who might be brand new from a country with little to no English. There could be students who are new to our country with little of their own literacy skills in their first language, and then everything in between. So it's really important that we respect the need for them to develop their first language, the foundation in their first language, because they need that. They need that foundation for them to build their English skills. So with these students, we want to make sure we use culturally responsive teaching practices, right? So a couple of things to consider. There are generalizations we can make in terms of how we work with ELLs, but the connection to their first language is such an important consideration, as is their culture. Like there are some cultures where it's considered disrespectful for children to look adults in the eye, to make eye contact. Whereas we wouldn't consider that. We actually look for that in a classroom. Or, there are different body language where their culture may consider it rude or inappropriate in school, whereas you might think it is appropriate for your classroom. So it's so critical to get to know what your students' backgrounds are so that you can understand their cultural norms, what they're coming to your classroom with. It's also important to recognize that not every student speaks for their entire culture. You might have a student from a country you've never had in a classroom before. You can't ask them questions and think, what would any learner from whatever country it is, how would they respond? That they're just one student. So, and that's a lot of pressure. So that's just an important little caveat to throw in there. But in terms of classroom practices, whereas on an IEP or a 504, accommodations and modifications are listed for us, for English language learners, we don't necessarily have that documentation. So some practices that are very helpful are visuals. I can't stress visuals enough, honestly, for lots of different kinds of learners, but especially ELLs. Discussion and group work is great because it helps them practice their English skills, but it also helps them to hear things in different ways. Extended wait time, which personally I use with every kind of learner, but especially an English language learner who needs time to process what they're hearing, translate it into their native language, and then translate it back into English to be able to speak in class. That's a lot of work. Paying attention to cultural vocabulary is important. There are things sometimes that just don't translate. Sentence frames are always really helpful. Pre-teaching, I think, is probably most beneficial for English language learners. But again, I put in there, visuals really are key. That is a tried and true method for English language learners. There are many acronyms that come along with ESL instruction. So I included a link here that you might want to bookmark in case you're reading and you come across an acronym you're not familiar with. I always say education is almost as bad as the military when it comes to acronyms, but ESOL in general is even worse than education in general or overall. So that's just a little helpful resource there. And then finally, we have our gifted students. If we are going to think about a population of students that ever is forgotten about, it's our gifted and talented students. So many teachers struggle with they think, I have this group of students who are struggling so much. I have to put all of my attention on them. Those gifted learners, they're going to be fine on their own. Well, that might be true, but not challenging them actually does make them decline in terms of their learning. So certain states do have gifted and talented programs, but I'll be honest, those are the things that are cut relatively early when budgets are tight, and we're in a time when budgets are tight. So there may not be as many opportunities for gifted and talented students to participate in a program. So that's even more reason that you, the classroom teacher, learn how to differentiate your instruction for kids who need to be challenged. I will tell you a really brief story. This is a story in a nutshell, but my older daughter went into pre-K reading at second grade level. They didn't really do testing in like reading levels in pre-K, but by kindergarten, we knew by the end of the year she was three grade levels ahead. But she wasn't getting any quality instruction because her teacher saw, she can read on her own. I'm going to focus on these students who are struggling. So by fourth grade, she was on grade level. So if you think about that, that's actually regression. If she were growing, she should have stayed 3 grade levels ahead every year, but she regressed to be on grade level. Obviously, that's not a bad thing to be on grade level. But why I share that is to say it really is a huge disservice to a child who should be challenged to not be challenged. It's almost as damaging as not addressing a struggling student's needs. So I'll just put that out there. Okay, so how we help our students, how we differentiate, well, we support all of our students by scaffolding our instruction. And when you think about scaffolding, like New York City buildings, how you always see scaffolding around them, right? That's not permanent, right? Scaffolding is meant to be taken away as it's not needed anymore. And that's the same with instructional scaffolding. We do support all of our students. It doesn't matter if they have a disability, are an English language learner, are gifted, or are not labeled anything. We want to make sure we're supporting them. Every student just has a different level of scaffolding, but the idea is that that's not permanent, that it's going to be scaled back. So ideally, by the end of the school year, if not much before that, they're able to work at grade level without any scaffolding at all. So I included two resources here for you that are really helpful. This one is Resource Guides for Scaffolding Instruction, which gives a ton of different ways that you can scaffold in all content areas. But then this ELA scaffold list in particular has very specific strategies you can use in ELA. But to be honest, you read and write in every content area. So it's helpful for all content areas. Don't let the ELA scare you if you're a non-ELA person. But those are great resources you might want to take a look at and bookmark for later. Okay, so a brief review of IEPs and 504s, because again, I know that you had this in your Foundations of Special Education course, but you know that IEPs are required when a student is identified as having a disability, and it's required that we follow it. If a student has a 504, we do have to follow it as well, but it's not exactly the same. It's a civil rights law rather than an education law. IEPs provide very specialized instruction where the focus is on what the student is learning in kind of the grand scheme of things, not even necessarily what they're learning at the grade level, but what they individually are learning. Whereas a 504 provides accommodations for the student to interact in the class. It's more about how the student is learning, not the what. With a 504 plan, it's meant for a student to access everything in the general education curriculum or in the general education classroom, just with a few supports in place that they may need to be successful. The IEP gives actual curricular kinds of academic things that the child needs to work on. States do receive funding for students with IEPs. That's not the same as 504s. And to have an IEP, students have to have one or more of the 13 classified disabilities. A 504, anybody can have, and it doesn't have to be one of those. It can even be things like lots of students today have anxiety and depression. They have 504 plans. Students with ADHD might need a 504 plan. So both of these documents, obviously parents have to consent to have the child evaluated. They are free, and they work to meet their needs in the classroom. But hopefully you've got a pretty solid understanding of the difference between the two. Accommodations and modifications are much more explicit in an IEP than they are in a 504. Because again, the 504 is to help the student access the general education curriculum. So for example, my daughter has a 504 plan for, she has social anxiety disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So her 504 plan has things like the teacher will check in with her when assignments need to be turned in, because she struggles with turning in assignments because of having to interact with people. Or it has things like the teacher will check in after directions are given to the class because she won't advocate for herself if she has a question. So none of that changes the content of what she's learning. It just puts accommodations in place to help her through so she can succeed in class. Whereas a 504 will have very specific academic goals that still are related to standards and grade level standards, but they're academic in nature rather than just accommodating to get the student to be successful with the general education curriculum. I hope that makes sense. I would assume again that this is review, but if you have questions, obviously you can feel free to ask. But I review this because, again, it's important to know that both of these documents are going to impact how you differentiate your instruction for your students. So let's revisit the learning target. Hopefully, you feel that you can compare the purposes and elements of a 504 plan and an IEP. Again, any question, please ask, because this is kind of the foundation now for what we're going to be doing going forward.